The doorbell rang at precisely 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months after I buried my husband of 40 years. I was in the garden tending to the roses Bart had planted for our 20th anniversary, trying to convince myself that life could continue normally, despite the gaping hole his absence had left in my daily routine. When I opened the front door, a distinguished gentleman in an expensive charcoal suit stood on my porch holding a leather briefcase and wearing the serious expression that lawyers seem to perfect in law school. "Mrs. Blackwood, my name is Edmund Thornfield from Thornfield & Associates. I have some rather extraordinary instructions from your late husband that I was to deliver precisely 6 months after his passing." My heart skipped a beat. Bart had been full of surprises throughout our marriage, but posthumous instructions delivered by lawyers was a new development even for him. "Instructions? Mr. Thornfield, my husband's will was read months ago. Everything was quite straightforward. Mrs. Blackwood, this matter is separate from the standard probate proceedings. May I come in? What I need to discuss with you is of a rather unusual nature." I led Mr. Thornfield into the living room, noting how he glanced around our modest home with the calculating eye of someone accustomed to appraising valuable property. Bart and I had lived comfortably, but not lavishly. He'd worked as a maritime historian specializing in lost shipwrecks, while I'd spent my career as an art historian at the local university. "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband came to my firm in 1985 with very specific instructions about a bequest that was to be delivered to you under particular circumstances." 1985? That's nearly 40 years ago. What kind of bequest requires 4 decades of waiting? The kind that depends on the completion of exactly 40 years of marriage, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband was quite specific about the timing. I felt a strange chill as Mr. Thornfield's words triggered a memory I'd buried so deeply I'd almost forgotten it existed. Suddenly, I was 28 years old again, standing in our tiny first apartment, having one of those silly, newlywed conversations about the future. "If you can stand being married to me for 40 years, Bart had said with that mischievous grin that had first attracted me to him, "I'll give you something impossible to imagine." I'd laughed and called him ridiculous, telling him that 40 years seemed like an impossibly long time when we'd only been married for 5 minutes. We'd never mentioned the conversation again, and honestly, I'd assumed Bart had forgotten about it entirely. "Mr. Thornfield, are you telling me that Bart remembered some silly bet we made as newlyweds? Mrs. Blackwood, your husband never forgot anything that mattered to him, and apparently, this particular promise mattered a great deal." Mr. Maw. Thornfield opened his briefcase and withdrew 3 items. An ornate golden key that looked like it belonged in a medieval castle, a sealed envelope with my name written in Bart's careful handwriting, and a smaller envelope containing what appeared to be an address. "Your husband's instructions were quite specific. If you completed exactly 40 years of marriage, which you did, Mrs. Blackwood, by precisely 11 days before his passing, I was to give you these items and this information." I stared at the key, which was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was heavy, clearly antique, with intricate Celtic knotwork carved into its surface and small jewels embedded in its head. "What does this key open?" "I believe the letter will explain everything, Mrs. Blackwood. However, your husband was very clear that I should emphasize one particular instruction. You are to handle this matter entirely alone. He specifically requested that you not involve your children or any other family members in whatever you discover." "Not involve Percival and Ophelia? That seems rather strange. We've always been a close family." "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm simply conveying your husband's explicit instructions." He was quite emphatic about this point. After Mr. Thornfield left, I sat in Bart's favorite armchair, holding the mysterious key, and staring at the envelope containing his final message to me. 40 years of marriage had taught me that my husband was capable of elaborate surprises, but this felt different, more significant than his usual romantic gestures. I opened the letter with trembling fingers and began reading Bart's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Rose, if you're reading this letter, it means you kept your end of our bargain and stayed married to me for exactly 40 years. It also means I'm no longer alive to see your face when you discover what I've been planning for nearly 4 decades. Do you remember our conversation in 1985 about impossible gifts? You laughed when I promised to give you something unimaginable if you could tolerate being my wife for 40 years. Rose, I meant every word of that promise, and I've spent the better part of our marriage making it come true. The address in the second envelope will lead you to something I've prepared for your future, a future that I hoped would be spent together, but which I now realize you may have to enjoy without me. Rose, this is perhaps the most important instruction I will ever give you. Go to Scotland alone. Do not tell Percival and Ophelia about this letter or what you discover there. I know this seems harsh, but trust me when I tell you that our children's love for you is genuine, but their interest in what I've prepared might not be. Use the key, enter the castle, and remember that you have always been my queen, even when you didn't know you deserved a crown. All my love, always and forever, Bartholomew. I read the letter 3 times before opening the second envelope, which contained an address in the Scottish Highlands, Ravens Hollow Castle, Glen Nevis, Inverness-shire. A castle. Bart had mentioned a castle in his letter, which seemed impossible. We'd never owned property outside of our modest home, never had the financial resources for international real estate investments, never even taken expensive vacations to exotic locations. But the key in my hand was real, heavy, and cold, and obviously ancient. The letter was written in Bart's unmistakable handwriting, and the address appeared to be legitimate. I could look up Ravens Hollow Castle online to confirm its existence. I spent the rest of the evening researching the property online, discovering that Ravens Hollow Castle was indeed real, a 16th century fortress in the Scottish Highlands that had been restored to its original grandeur. The photographs showed a magnificent stone structure with towers, battlements, and gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. But according to every website I could find, the castle was privately owned and not open to the public. There was no information about who owned it, when it had been purchased, or how someone might arrange to visit. As I prepared for bed that night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. I was going to Scotland to discover what Bart had been planning for 40 years, and I was going to follow his instructions about keeping the journey secret from our children. Some promises, apparently, were worth keeping even when the person who made them was no longer alive to see them fulfilled. And some husbands, I was beginning to realize, were capable of surprises that extended far beyond the grave. Tomorrow, I would book a flight to Scotland and discover what impossible gift Bart had been preparing for nearly half our lifetime. The flight to Edinburgh took 8 hours, during which I had ample time to question the sanity of flying halfway around the world based on a mysterious letter and an antique key. At 68 years old, I'd never taken an international trip alone, never made impulsive decisions about travel, and certainly never embarked on what felt increasingly like a treasure hunt orchestrated by my deceased husband. But I also couldn't ignore the growing certainty that Bart had been planning something extraordinary for decades, something so significant that he'd felt compelled to keep it secret, even from me, until after his death. I'd told Percival and Ophelia that I was taking a brief vacation to process my grief, which wasn't entirely untrue. What I didn't mention was my destination, or the mysterious circumstances that had prompted my sudden desire for international travel. "Mom, are you sure you should be traveling alone so soon after Dad's death?" Percival had asked when I called to inform him of my plans. "Maybe Ophelia or I should come with you. Darling, I need some time alone to think about the future. Your father's death has made me realize how little of the world I've actually seen. But Scotland seems like such a random choice. When did you develop an interest in Scottish history?" I'd deflected his questions with vague references to wanting to explore my ancestral roots, which satisfied both children's curiosity while keeping Bart's instructions about secrecy. The rental car journey from Edinburgh to Glen Nevis took another 3 hours through increasingly dramatic Highland scenery. Rolling hills gave way to rugged mountains, and civilized farmland transformed into wild moors that looked exactly like the romantic Scottish landscapes I'd seen in movies. As I drove deeper into the Highlands, I began to understand why Bart might have chosen Scotland for whatever surprise he'd been planning. The landscape felt otherworldly, ancient, and mysterious, the perfect setting for dramatic gestures and elaborate secrets. Ravens Hollow Castle appeared suddenly around a curve in the narrow Highland road, and my first glimpse took my breath away completely. The photographs I'd found online had not conveyed the sheer majesty of the structure rising from its hillside perch like something from a medieval fantasy. The castle was enormous, 3 stories of gray stone with 4 circular towers connected by high walls and battlements. Massive oak doors were set into an arched entrance, flanked by carved stone lions. Gardens surrounded the structure in carefully planned terraces that cascaded down the hillside in a riot of color, from flowers I couldn't identify from a distance. I parked in what appeared to be a designated area near the main entrance and sat in my rental car for several minutes, staring at the castle and trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some modest cottage or hunting lodge that Bart might have purchased as a retirement surprise. This was a fortress fit for royalty. The golden key felt warm in my hand as I approached the massive front doors, which were carved with intricate Celtic designs that matched the knotwork on the key itself. Above the entrance, a coat of arms I didn't recognize was carved into the stone, flanked by Latin words I couldn't translate. The key slid into the lock with perfect precision, turning smoothly despite the obvious age of both the key and the mechanism. The doors opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing an entrance hall that belonged in a museum rather than a private residence. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood. We've been expecting you." I spun around to find an elderly gentleman in formal livery standing in the entrance hall, apparently having materialized from nowhere while I'd been gaping at my surroundings. "You've been expecting me? But how did you know I was coming?" "Mrs. Blackwood, I am Henderson, the castle's head butler. Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions about your eventual arrival and your needs during your stay with us." "Bart left instructions? How long have you been working here?" "I've been in Mr. Blackwood's employ for 15 years, Mrs. Blackwood. The entire staff has been preparing for your arrival for quite some time." I looked around the entrance hall, taking in details that became more impressive with closer examination. The stone walls were hung with tapestries that looked genuinely medieval, interspersed with portraits of nobles in period dress. A grand staircase curved upward to a gallery that overlooked the main hall, its banister carved from what appeared to be a single piece of oak. "Henderson, I'm afraid I don't understand what's happening here. My husband never mentioned owning property in Scotland, never mentioned employing staff, never mentioned anything about any of this. Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps you would like to see your private quarters and refresh yourself after your journey?" Mr. Blackwood left a detailed letter explaining everything, which I was instructed to give you once you'd had time to settle in. Henderson led me through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly through the castle, past rooms filled with antique furniture, oil paintings, and decorative objects that looked like they belonged in the finest museums. Every window offered spectacular views of the highland landscape surrounding the castle. My private quarters turned out to be a suite of rooms that could have housed a royal family. A sitting room with a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, a bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in silk curtains, a private bathroom that somehow managed to combine medieval architecture with modern luxury, and a small library filled with leather-bound books. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'll give you time to rest and explore your chambers. When you're ready, please ring the bell beside your bed, and I'll bring you the letter Mr. Blackwood prepared for this occasion." After Henderson left, I stood in the center of my palatial bedroom, trying to comprehend the impossibility of my situation. Less than 24 hours ago, I'd been a middle-class widow living quietly in suburban Connecticut. Now I was apparently the mistress of a Scottish castle with servants who'd been preparing for my arrival for years. I walked to the window and looked out over gardens that extended as far as I could see, landscaped with the precision of professionals and maintained with obvious care. In the distance, I could see other buildings on the castle grounds, stables, what looked like a greenhouse complex, and several smaller structures that might have housed additional staff. This wasn't just a property Bart had purchased, this was an estate, a functioning medieval castle that someone had spent considerable time and money restoring to its original glory. But how had my husband, a maritime historian who'd never shown signs of extraordinary wealth, managed to acquire and maintain something like this? And why had he kept it secret for what Henderson suggested had been at least 15 years? I rang the bell beside my bed, ready to read whatever explanation Bart had prepared for the most extraordinary surprise of our 40-year marriage. Some secrets, I was beginning to understand, were too large to reveal, while the secret keeper was still alive to face questions about them. And some husbands, apparently, were capable of creating entire alternate realities, while their wives remained completely oblivious to their existence. Henderson returned within minutes, carrying a silver tray containing tea service and an envelope sealed with dark blue wax, bearing what appeared to be the same coat of arms I'd noticed above the castle entrance. The envelope was thick, suggesting a substantial letter, and my name was written across it in Bart's distinctive handwriting. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood was quite specific that you should read this letter in private and take whatever time you need to process the information it contains. Henderson, before I read this, I need to ask you something. How long have you known my husband? I first met Mr. Blackwood 17 years ago, Mrs. Blackwood, when he purchased Ravenshollow Castle. I had been working for the previous owners and was included as part of the estate's transition. 17 years? Bart bought this castle 17 years ago? Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood. He spent considerable time and resources restoring the property to its current condition, though he only visited perhaps twice per year until recently. I felt dizzy as I processed this information. 17 years ago would have been 2007, when I thought Bart was simply taking his usual research trips to study maritime archaeology. Apparently, those research trips had included purchasing and renovating a Scottish castle. Henderson, did my husband ever mention why he kept this property secret from his family? Mr. Blackwood was quite clear that Ravenshollow was being prepared as a special gift for you, Mrs. Blackwood, to be revealed only under specific circumstances. He felt that the surprise would be more meaningful if you discovered it naturally, rather than having it explained while he was alive to see your reaction. After Henderson withdrew, I settled into the luxurious sitting room with my tea and carefully broke the wax seal on Bart's letter. Inside, I found several pages of his handwriting, along with what appeared to be historical documents and photographs. My beloved Rose, if you're reading this letter in Ravenshollow Castle, it means you've taken the first step toward discovering the most important secret I've kept throughout our marriage. I hope you'll forgive the elaborate nature of this revelation, but some stories are too extraordinary to tell without proper setting and context. Rose, everything you're experiencing at Ravenshollow, the castle, the staff, the grounds, belongs to you. I purchased this estate 17 years ago, and have been preparing it as your future residence, though I'd hoped to share many years here with you, rather than leaving you to discover it alone. But to understand why I chose this particular castle, and why I've spent nearly 2 decades preparing it for you, you need to know about something I discovered 25 years ago that changed our financial circumstances in ways I never told you about. I paused in my reading, feeling increasingly disoriented by these revelations about secret real estate purchases and hidden financial circumstances. I'd managed our household budget for 40 years and had never detected any unusual income or expenses that would suggest Bart had resources sufficient to purchase Scottish castles. Rose, in 1999, while researching shipwrecks in the Scottish Highlands for a book about maritime disasters, I discovered something that historians had been searching for since 1746, the lost treasure of the Stuart royal family. After the Battle of Culloden, when Bonnie Prince Charlie's supporters realized their cause was lost, several Highland clans worked together to hide the royal treasure, crown jewels, gold, silver, and priceless artifacts, somewhere in the mountains near Glen Nevis. The treasure was intended to fund a future restoration of the Stuart line, but the location was lost when the men who hid it were killed in subsequent battles with English forces. For 253 years, treasure hunters, historians, and archaeologists have searched the Highlands for what became known as the Lost Crown of Scotland. The treasure was estimated to be worth millions, but most experts assumed it had been discovered decades ago and sold privately, or that the location had been lost forever. I set down the letter and stared out the window at the Highland landscape, trying to process what Bart was telling me. He'd found a legendary treasure that had been lost for over 2 centuries, and he'd apparently used that discovery to purchase this castle. Rose, I found the treasure in 1999, hidden in a cave system about 15 miles from where you're sitting right now. The location had been concealed so cleverly that it took me 3 summers of systematic searching to locate the entrance, and another year to excavate the cache safely. What I discovered exceeded every estimate historians had made about the treasure's value. Gold coins, silver plate, jeweled crowns, ceremonial weapons, and artifacts that represented the artistic and cultural heritage of Scottish royalty. When I had the collection professionally appraised, the conservative estimate was £500 million. I nearly dropped my teacup as I absorbed this information. £500 million? That was more money than I could even conceptualize, let alone imagine my modest husband acquiring through treasure hunting. Rose, I know you must be wondering why I never told you about this discovery, and why I didn't immediately use the treasure to transform our lifestyle. The answer is complicated, but it comes down to my certainty that sudden enormous wealth would have changed our family dynamics in ways that might not have been beneficial. I'd watched what happened to people who won lotteries or inherited unexpected fortunes, how relatives and friends began treating them differently, how children developed unrealistic expectations about money, how marriages were strained by the pressures that accompanied sudden wealth. More importantly, I wanted to ensure that if something happened to me, you would be financially secure and treated with the dignity and respect you've always deserved, but might not have received if our children knew about the extent of our resources. I thought about Percival and Ophelia, both of whom had struggled financially despite their education and career opportunities. They'd often made comments about looking forward to inheriting our estate, though they assumed that would consist of our modest house and Bart's pension savings. Rose, I spent 17 years creating Ravenshollow as a place where you could live like the queen you've always been in my eyes. The castle is fully staffed, completely maintained, and financially endowed to operate indefinitely without requiring any contribution from you. But the castle is only part of what I'm leaving you. Tomorrow, Henderson will show you the treasure vault I've constructed beneath the castle, where the Stuart Royal collection is displayed in a private museum that belongs entirely to you. You now control a fortune that most people couldn't spend in 10 lifetimes, and you have the resources to live however you choose for the remainder of your days. My darling Rose, you married a maritime historian, and discovered you're now the secret queen of a Scottish castle with a royal treasury in your basement. Welcome to your new life. All my eternal love, Bartholomew. I finished reading and sat in stunned silence, looking around the luxurious sitting room that apparently belonged to me, in a castle that apparently belonged to me, furnished with a treasure that had been lost for 278 years. Some husbands left their wives comfortable retirement funds. My husband had apparently made me one of the wealthiest women in the world while creating a fairy tale setting for me to enjoy that wealth. The question now was whether I was ready to become the queen Bart had always believed I deserved to be. That night, I barely slept, despite the luxurious four-poster bed that could have accommodated an entire royal family. I lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling, trying to reconcile the humble life I'd lived for 40 years with the extraordinary circumstances Bart had apparently been orchestrating since 1999. Every few hours I would get up and walk to the window to confirm that the Highland landscape was real, that I wasn't experiencing some elaborate grief-induced hallucination. The moonlight illuminating the castle grounds and the distant mountains convinced me that whatever was happening was genuinely occurring, regardless of how impossible it seemed. By morning, I'd reached a decision to see the treasure vault that Henderson had mentioned, partly because I needed concrete proof of Bart's claims, and partly because I couldn't imagine going home to Connecticut without understanding the full scope of what my husband had discovered and prepared. Henderson appeared promptly at 9 a.m. with breakfast service and the discreet inquiry about whether I felt ready to tour the castle's historical collection. Henderson, before we proceed, I need to understand something about the legal status of this treasure. If Bart found artifacts that belong to Scottish cultural heritage, surely there are laws about ownership and reporting such discoveries. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood was very thorough about the legal aspects of his discovery. The treasure was found on private land that he had purchased specifically for archaeological research, and he worked with British authorities to establish clear legal ownership. All artifacts have been properly documented and registered with appropriate governmental agencies. And the authorities were comfortable with him keeping a collection of this historical significance in private hands? Mr. Blackwood donated several pieces to the National Museum of Scotland and provided substantial funding for Highland historical preservation. In exchange, he received legal clearance to maintain the majority of the collection in private custody, with the understanding that it would eventually be made available for scholarly research. This information helped ease some of my concerns about the legitimacy of Bart's treasure acquisition. My husband had been methodical about everything else in his life, Apparently he'd been equally careful about the legal and ethical dimensions of his archaeological discovery. Henderson led me through corridors I hadn't seen the previous day, past rooms that contained what appeared to be priceless antiques and artwork. We descended a stone staircase that looked medieval but felt surprisingly modern underfoot, suggesting recent renovation to ensure safety while maintaining historical authenticity. Mr. Blackwood spent considerable effort creating a proper environment for displaying and preserving the Stuart collection, Henderson explained as we approached a heavy wooden door set into the stone wall. Climate control, security systems, and conservation protocols that meet museum standards. The door opened to reveal something that belonged in the finest museums in the world. The treasure vault was enormous, a series of connected rooms carved from the castle's foundation and transformed into elegant exhibition spaces. Display cases lined the walls, each containing artifacts that gleamed under professional lighting systems. Gold crowns, set with emeralds, sapphires, and rubies that caught the light like captured starlight. Silver ceremonial weapons with handles wrapped in gold wire. Jeweled chalices that had probably graced royal tables centuries before the American Revolution. My God, Henderson, this is extraordinary. Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood often said that the collection represented the finest examples of Scottish royal craftsmanship from the Stuart period. I walked slowly through the treasure rooms, reading the detailed placards that Bart had apparently written to explain each artifact's historical significance. His descriptions revealed deep knowledge about not just the objects themselves, but their cultural and political context within Scottish history. This crown was worn by Mary, Queen of Scots, I read aloud from one placard. The emeralds were gifts from the French court, while the gold was mined in the Scottish Highlands during the 16th century. Mr. Blackwood researched each piece extensively, Henderson confirmed. He wanted to understand not just their monetary value, but their stories and connections to the people who had owned them. In the final treasure room, I found something that took my breath away completely. An exact replica of the throne room at Holyrood Palace, furnished with the actual throne chair that had been used by Scottish monarchs for centuries. Henderson, is that a real royal throne? Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood. According to Mr. Blackwood's research, this chair was used for the coronation of several Stuart monarchs before being hidden with the rest of the treasure in 1746. I approached the throne with something approaching reverence, running my fingers along carved armrests that had been touched by actual kings and queens centuries ago. The chair was upholstered in deep blue velvet that looked recently restored, but the wooden frame showed the patina of age and historical significance. Mr. Blackwood often mentioned that he hoped you would use this room for special occasions, Henderson said quietly. He felt that you deserved to experience what it felt like to sit on an actual royal throne. Bart wanted me to sit on a throne? Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood often said that you had been his queen for 40 years and that it was time for you to have a crown that matched your dignity. I stared at the throne, thinking about 40 years of marriage to a man who'd apparently seen me as royalty, while I'd seen myself as a middle-class professor with ordinary ambitions and modest expectations. Henderson, what exactly did my husband envision for my life here at Ravens Hollow? Mr. Blackwood hoped that you would choose to live here as the mistress of the castle, surrounded by beauty and luxury that honored your position as his beloved wife and the guardian of this historical collection. And if I chose not to live here, if I decided to return to Connecticut and continue my normal life, Mrs. Blackwood, everything here belongs to you regardless of where you choose to live. Mr. Blackwood's only requirement was that you have the option to live like a queen if you decided that appealed to you. I looked around the treasure vault, calculating the impossible wealth it represented and the responsibility it entailed. Bart had given me not just money, but cultural artifacts that connected me to centuries of Scottish history and royal tradition. Henderson, I need to ask you something important. Did my husband ever mention anything about our children's relationship to this inheritance? Henderson's expression became carefully neutral, suggesting he'd been expecting this question. Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood felt very strongly that the treasure and castle should remain in your sole control during your lifetime, without interference from other family members who might not understand the historical significance of the collection. He was concerned that Percival and Ophelia would see the treasure as a financial asset rather than a cultural responsibility. Mr. Blackwood felt that sudden enormous wealth might change your family relationships in ways that wouldn't benefit anyone involved. Some treasure hunters spent their lives searching for gold and jewels. My husband had found the greatest treasure in Scottish history and spent 17 years transforming it into a fairy tale life for his wife. Now I had to decide whether I was brave enough to become the queen he'd always believed I deserved to be. That evening, I sat in what Henderson informed me was my private dining room, eating a meal prepared by what he casually mentioned was the castle's chef. The dining room was smaller than the formal banquet hall he'd shown me earlier, but still grand enough to host a dinner party for 20 people. The meal was extraordinary. Locally sourced Scottish salmon, roasted vegetables from the castle gardens, and wine from what Henderson described as Mr. Blackwood's private cellar. Everything was served on china that bore the same coat of arms I'd seen throughout the castle. Henderson, whose family crest is displayed throughout Raven's Hollow? That is the Blackwood family crest, Mrs. Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood had it researched and designed when he purchased the castle. He felt that establishing a proper heraldic identity was important for the dignity of the estate. Bart created his own family coat of arms? Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood. He worked with the College of Arms in London to establish legitimate heraldic rights based on his Scottish ancestry and his guardianship of the Stuart treasure collection. I stared at the intricate design embroidered on the napkin beside my plate, realizing that Bart had not only acquired a castle and royal treasure, but had also established the legal framework for us to live as actual Scottish nobility. After dinner, Henderson presented me with what he described as Mr. Blackwood's private journals, detailing his research and planning for Raven's Hollow. The journals filled 3 leather-bound volumes and chronicled 17 years of meticulous preparation for my eventual discovery of his secret life. I spent the evening reading entries that revealed the incredible scope of Bart's planning. March 15, 2008. Completed negotiations for purchasing additional acreage surrounding the castle. Rose will need privacy and security when she eventually takes residence here. September 3, 2010. Interviewed potential household staff. Must find people who understand they're serving someone who deserves royal treatment, even if she doesn't realize her own worth. December 12, 2014. Finished installing the museum-quality climate control system in the treasure vault. Every artifact must be preserved perfectly for Rose's enjoyment and eventual decisions about public access. April 7, 2018. Rose mentioned feeling unappreciated after the university passed her over for the department chair position again. She has no idea that she'll soon have her own castle, where her intelligence and dignity will be properly recognized. The journals revealed that Bart had been thinking about me constantly during his secret trips to Scotland. Viewing every improvement to the castle as a gift for the wife he felt deserved better than the modest life their public finances could provide. But the most revealing entry was dated just 6 months before his death, June 15, 2024. Visited Raven's Hollow for what may be the last time before Rose discovers it. My health is declining faster than I'd hoped, but everything is prepared for her arrival. Henderson and the staff understand their responsibilities. The legal documents are finalized. Rose will have everything she needs to live like the queen she's always been. My greatest regret is that I won't be there to see her face when she realizes what she's inherited. But perhaps it's better this way. She can make decisions about her future without worrying about my feelings or expectations. I pray she'll choose to stay at Raven's Hollow and accept the life of dignity and luxury I've tried to create for her. But even if she decides to return to Connecticut, she'll know that for 40 years, someone loved her enough to build her a kingdom. I closed the journal, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of love and planning that Bart had invested in creating this elaborate surprise. Every detail of the castle, every piece of furniture, every member of the staff had been chosen specifically to honor his vision of how I deserved to be treated. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. I was having breakfast in the morning room when Henderson appeared with an expression of diplomatic concern. Mrs. Blackwood, I've received several phone calls from your son Percival. He seems quite worried about your extended absence and has been asking detailed questions about your whereabouts. My heart sank as I realized I'd been at Raven's Hollow for 3 days without contacting my children. In my amazement at discovering Bart's secret kingdom, I'd completely forgotten my promise to check in regularly during my vacation. Henderson, what exactly has Percival been asking? He called the hotel where you said you'd be staying in Edinburgh, and when they had no record of your reservation, he became concerned about your safety. He's also been asking whether you've made any unusual financial decisions or been contacted by anyone claiming to represent your husband's estate. I felt a chill of apprehension as I recognized the implications of Percival's investigation. My son was clearly suspicious about my sudden trip to Scotland, and his question suggested he might suspect I was dealing with unknown aspects of Bart's financial affairs. Henderson, do you think Percival might attempt to locate me here? Mrs. Blackwood, it's certainly possible that persistent inquiry could eventually lead him to Raven's Hollow, especially if he involves private investigators or legal professionals in his search. I thought about Bart's explicit warnings about keeping Raven's Hollow secret from our children. At the time, his instructions had seemed unnecessarily cautious, but now I was beginning to understand his concerns about how Percival and Ophelia might react to discovering their parents' hidden wealth. Henderson, what would happen if my children learned about the castle and treasure collection? Henderson's diplomatic expression suggested he'd been expecting this question and had given it considerable thought. Mrs. Blackwood, in my experience, unexpected inherited wealth often creates family dynamics that can be quite challenging to navigate. Mr. Blackwood was particularly concerned that knowledge of the treasure might change how your children related to you personally. He was worried they'd see me as a source of inheritance rather than as their mother. Mr. Blackwood felt strongly that your final years should be spent enjoying relationships based on genuine affection rather than managing expectations about financial distribution. That afternoon, I called Percival from the castle's private phone line to reassure him about my safety while carefully avoiding any details about my actual location or activities. Mom, I've been worried sick about you. The hotel in Edinburgh said they'd never heard of you, and when I called the airline, they said you'd flown into Scotland but couldn't give me any other information. Percival, I'm perfectly fine. I decided to be more spontaneous about my itinerary and have been staying in different places depending on what sounded interesting. Mom, this doesn't sound like you at all. Since when do you make spontaneous travel decisions? And why haven't you been answering your cell phone? I realized that my newfound independence and confidence, products of discovering I owned a castle and royal treasure, were already changing my behavior in ways that worried my children. Some secrets I was learning were impossible to keep indefinitely, and some queens had to decide whether they were ready to reveal their crowns to family members who might not be prepared to see their mother as royalty. 3 more days passed before I received the phone call that forced me to confront the reality that my secret couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. I was in the castle library, reading about Stuart dynasty history from books that Bart had apparently collected specifically for my education, when Henderson informed me that Ophelia was on the phone and sounded quite distressed. Mother, thank God you're finally answering. Percival and I have been frantic with worry. We know you're not where you said you'd be, and we've been considering filing a missing person report. Ophelia, darling, I told Percival that I'm perfectly safe. I've simply been exploring Scotland more extensively than I originally planned. Mother, this isn't like you. In 40 years, you've never taken a spontaneous trip anywhere, let alone disappeared to a foreign country without proper planning. We're concerned that grief might be affecting your judgment. I felt a flash of irritation at my daughter's suggestion that my newfound independence represented impaired judgment rather than personal growth. Living at Raven's Hollow for a week had already changed my perspective about my own capabilities and desires in ways that apparently alarmed my children. Ophelia, I'm a grown woman perfectly capable of making travel decisions without consulting my adult children. Mother, that's exactly what we're worried about. You're talking like a completely different person. The mother I know would never speak to us with this kind of authority. Authority. The word struck me as particularly revealing about how my children perceived my personality and decision-making capabilities. Apparently, the confident tone I'd developed since discovering my royal inheritance was noticeable enough to concern them. Ophelia, perhaps discovering that I can take care of myself shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Mother, please tell us exactly where you are. Percival has been researching your credit card transactions, and we know you've rented a car and driven into the Scottish Highlands. We just want to make sure you're safe. I felt cold understanding that my children had been tracking my financial activities and investigating my whereabouts with the persistence of people who suspected something significant was being hidden from them. Percival has been researching my credit card transactions? Why would you think that's appropriate? Because Dad just died 6 months ago, and suddenly you're acting completely out of character while traveling alone in a foreign country. Mother, we love you, and we're worried that someone might be taking advantage of your emotional vulnerability. After ending the call with promises to check in more regularly, I found Henderson and asked him to arrange a secure international phone line so I could contact Mr. Thornfield, the lawyer who delivered Bart's initial instructions. Mr. Thornfield, I need advice about a developing situation with my children that threatens the privacy of my husband's bequest. Mrs. Blackwood, what kind of situation has developed? My children are investigating my travel activities and seem to suspect that I'm dealing with unknown aspects of my husband's estate. I'm concerned they might eventually locate Ravenshollow and discover the treasure collection. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband anticipated this possibility and left very specific legal instructions about protecting your privacy and ownership rights. The castle and collection are held in an irrevocable trust with you as sole beneficiary and trustee. Even if your children discover the property's existence, they would have no legal standing to access the estate or information about its contents. But what about family relationships? If they learn that I've inherited extraordinary wealth while allowing them to believe we have modest resources, won't that create permanent damage to our relationships? Mrs. Blackwood, that decision ultimately rests with you. Your husband hoped you would have time to adjust to your new circumstances before making choices about family disclosure, but he also understood that secrets of this magnitude can be difficult to maintain indefinitely. That evening, I made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I called both of my children and invited them to join me in Scotland for what I described as an important family conversation about your father's legacy. Mother, what kind of legacy conversation requires traveling to Scotland? Percival asked with obvious suspicion. The kind that your father spent 17 years planning and that I've spent the past week trying to understand myself. 17 years? Mother, what are you talking about? Percival, your father left me some very significant surprises that I think you and Ophelia should learn about directly rather than discovering them through your investigations into my credit card transactions. 2 days later, I stood in the castle's entrance hall waiting for my children to arrive, wearing an outfit that Henderson had tactfully suggested from Mrs. Blackwood's wardrobe, clothing that had been purchased and stored at the castle specifically for my eventual residence there. The dress was elegant, but not ostentatious, clearly expensive, but not flashy, perfectly fitted, and obviously tailored. Looking at myself in the entrance hall's ornate mirror, I realized I looked like someone who belonged in a castle, someone who possessed the confidence and authority that came from knowing she owned extraordinary wealth and historical treasures. When Percival and Ophelia's rental car pulled up the castle drive, I watched through the window as they stared at Ravenshollow with expressions of complete bewilderment. They sat in their car for several minutes, apparently trying to process why their mother had invited them to meet her at what appeared to be a major tourist attraction. "Mother?" Percival called uncertainly as I opened the massive front doors. "What is this place? Why are we meeting you at some kind of museum?" "Percival, Ophelia, welcome to Ravenshollow Castle. Come inside, and I'll explain everything your father wanted you to know about the life he prepared for me." As my children entered the castle, I watched their faces register the same amazement and disorientation I'd experienced upon my own arrival. But I also detected something else in their expressions: calculation, assessment, and what appeared to be rapid mental arithmetic about the value of what they were seeing. "Mother," Ophelia said slowly, "whose castle is this, and what does it have to do with Dad's legacy?" "This castle belongs to me, darling, along with everything in it. Your father spent the last 17 years of his life creating this as a gift for my future." Some children learned about their parents' secret lives gradually, through hints and partial revelations. My children were about to discover that their father had made their mother a secret queen, and that the modest family they'd grown up in had been an elaborate fiction designed to protect them from expectations they might not have been able to handle. Whether our family relationships would survive this revelation remained to be seen. The silence in the entrance hall stretched for nearly a full minute as Percival and Ophelia absorbed my statement about owning Ravenshollow Castle. I watched their faces cycle through disbelief, confusion, and what appeared to be rapid calculations about the implications of their mother's unexpected wealth. "Mother, what do you mean this castle belongs to you?" Percival asked with the careful tone of someone speaking to a person who might be experiencing delusions. "I mean that your father purchased Ravenshollow 17 years ago and spent the subsequent years preparing it as my residence. Everything here, the castle, the grounds, the furnishings, the staff, now belongs to me." Ophelia looked around the entrance hall with obvious appreciation for the expensive artwork and antiques, her interior designer's eye automatically assessing the value of what she was seeing. "Mother, this property must be worth millions. How could Dad have afforded something like this without us knowing about it?" "That's exactly what I asked Henderson when I arrived here a week ago. The answer is complicated and involves a discovery your father made 25 years ago that changed our financial circumstances dramatically." I led them into the main drawing room, where Henderson had arranged tea service on a table that had probably been crafted for 18th century nobility. As my children settled into chairs that could have furnished a royal palace, I began explaining Bart's discovery of the Stuart treasure and his decision to keep our newfound wealth secret throughout our marriage. "You're saying Dad found some kind of lost treasure?" Percival interrupted. "Mother, that sounds like something from an adventure novel, not real life." "I understand your skepticism, Percival. I felt the same way when I read your father's letter explaining everything. But the evidence is quite compelling." I handed them copies of the historical documents Bart had left for me, including photographs of the treasure cache before he'd moved it to the castle, legal paperwork establishing his ownership of the collection, and correspondence with British authorities about the archaeological significance of his discovery. "My God," Ophelia whispered as she studied photographs of golden crowns and jeweled artifacts. "These pieces look like they belong in the Tower of London. According to your father's research, they're significantly more valuable and historically important than many of the items displayed in royal collections. The Stuart treasure was hidden for 278 years and represents the finest examples of Scottish royal craftsmanship from the medieval period." Percival examined the legal documents with his accountant's attention to detail, apparently searching for evidence that the whole story was an elaborate fraud or misunderstanding. "Mother, these documents appear to be legitimate, but I still don't understand why Dad kept something this significant secret from his family for over 2 decades. Your father was concerned that sudden enormous wealth would change our family relationships in ways that might not be beneficial. He wanted to ensure that our marriage and your childhoods weren't influenced by expectations about inherited money." "But Mother," Ophelia said with obvious frustration, "we struggled financially throughout our entire childhoods. We took student loans for college, worked multiple jobs, lived modestly while apparently sitting on a fortune worth hundreds of millions. How could Dad justify keeping us ignorant about resources that could have made our lives significantly easier?" I recognized the anger in Ophelia's voice and realized that Bart's concerns about family dynamics had been well-founded. My children were already calculating how their lives might have been different if they'd known about the treasure, rather than focusing on the extraordinary gift Bart had created for my future. Your father felt that character was built through overcoming challenges rather than through easy access to inherited wealth. He wanted you both to develop independence and work ethics that wouldn't be compromised by expectations about family money. Character building? Percival's tone carried obvious bitterness. Mother, I've been working 60-hour weeks for 15 years trying to build financial security for my family. Meanwhile, Dad was secretly maintaining a Scottish castle while watching me struggle with mortgage payments and college funds for my children. I felt defensive about Bart's decisions, recognizing that my children were processing the revelation exactly as he'd feared they would, by focusing on how the secrecy had disadvantaged them rather than appreciating the extraordinary nature of what he'd accomplished. Percival, your father's decision to keep the treasure secret wasn't about punishing you or Ophelia. It was about protecting our family from the complications that accompany sudden wealth. What complications? Ophelia demanded. The complication of being able to afford nice things? The complication of not worrying about financial security? The complication of being able to pursue careers based on passion rather than economic necessity? Henderson appeared discreetly in the doorway, apparently sensing the tension in the conversation and wanting to offer assistance. Perhaps the children would like to see the treasure collection, he suggested diplomatically. Mr. Blackwood always felt that experiencing the artifacts directly would help people understand the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Yes, I agreed, recognizing that abstract discussions about wealth were less compelling than actually seeing the Stuart Royal collection. I think you both need to understand exactly what your father found and why he felt such responsibility for preserving it. As Henderson led us toward the treasure vault, I noticed that both of my children had become very quiet, apparently processing the implications of owning artifacts that had belonged to Scottish royalty. The competitive dynamics I'd sometimes observed between them seemed to be intensifying as they contemplated inheritance issues. Mother, Percival said as we descended the stone staircase, what happens to all of this when you're no longer able to manage such a large estate? Are you asking about inheritance, Percival? I'm asking about practical planning for assets of this magnitude. Properties like this require specialized management, legal oversight, tax planning, insurance considerations. Your father left very detailed instructions about the long-term management of the estate and collection, I interrupted, recognizing that Percival was already thinking about the castle as a business asset, rather than as a home where his mother might choose to live. As we entered the treasure vault, both of my children fell completely silent, staring at the displays of golden crowns, jeweled weapons, and royal artifacts with expressions of awe mixed with obvious financial calculation. This is extraordinary, Ophelia finally managed. Mother, you're literally one of the wealthiest people in the world. Some children learned about their parents' hidden assets and felt grateful for unexpected family security. My children were learning about inherited wealth and immediately beginning to calculate their own positions in relation to resources they'd never known existed. Bart's warnings about family dynamics were proving to be more prescient than I'd hoped. The transformation in my children's behavior after seeing the treasure vault was both immediate and unsettling. Within hours of discovering the extent of my inheritance, they'd shifted from concerned offspring worried about their mother's mysterious travels to strategic advisors eager to discuss proper management of extraordinary assets. Mother, we need to talk about security protocols for a collection of this value, Percival announced over dinner, which the castle chef had prepared specifically to accommodate my children's visit. Insurance, documentation, professional appraisals, tax implications, there are dozens of considerations that require immediate attention. Your father spent 17 years addressing those considerations, Percival. Everything has been properly documented, insured, and legally structured. But Mother, Dad's planning was designed for different circumstances. Now that you're the sole owner of assets worth hundreds of millions, you need contemporary financial advice about optimization, diversification, and estate planning. I noticed that Percival's language had become increasingly formal and business-oriented, as if he were speaking to a client rather than his mother. The casual affection that had characterized our relationship for 35 years had been replaced by the careful professionalism he used with his accounting firm's wealthiest customers. Percival, are you suggesting that your father's arrangements are inadequate? I'm suggesting that managing wealth of this magnitude requires specialized expertise that might benefit from family input and contemporary financial strategies. Ophelia had taken a different but equally concerning approach, focusing on what she described as lifestyle optimization for my new circumstances. Mother, you'll need a complete wardrobe appropriate for your position as mistress of a castle like this. Personal stylists, social secretaries, event planners. There's an entire infrastructure required for living at this level of society. Ophelia, I've been living here for over a week and haven't felt lacking in any necessary amenities. But Mother, you're thinking too small. With resources like this, you could be hosting charity galas, cultural events, political fundraisers. You could have significant social influence if you positioned yourself strategically. I realized that both of my children had immediately begun imagining expanded roles for themselves in relation to my newfound wealth. Percival as financial advisor and manager, Ophelia as lifestyle consultant and social coordinator. Neither seemed particularly interested in my own feelings about living at Ravenshollow or my desires for how to spend my remaining years. Children, what if I told you that I was considering selling the castle and donating the treasure collection to appropriate museums? The alarm that flashed across both their faces was revealing. Mother, that would be extremely premature, Percival said quickly. Major financial decisions shouldn't be made without comprehensive analysis of alternatives and implications. And Mother, think about the cultural impact you could have by maintaining the collection privately, Ophelia added. Private ownership allows for more flexibility in how the artifacts are displayed and shared with the public. I recognize that my hypothetical question about selling had triggered immediate protective responses, as if my children had already begun thinking of the castle and treasure as family assets that required their input before any major decisions could be made. That evening, after my children had retired to their guest rooms, I had a private conversation with Henderson about my observations of their behavior. Henderson, did my husband leave any specific instructions about how to handle family pressures regarding the estate management? Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood was quite specific that all decisions about the castle and collection should remain entirely in your control, without influence from family members who might not understand the historical significance of what he'd preserved. He anticipated that Percival and Ophelia might try to influence my choices? Mr. Blackwood felt strongly that people who hadn't spent years researching the collection's cultural importance might view it primarily as a financial asset rather than as a responsibility to Scottish heritage. The next morning brought a conversation that confirmed my growing concerns about my children's motivations. I found Percival and Ophelia in the castle library, huddled over laptops and legal documents, apparently conducting research about estate management and inheritance planning. Mother, we've been discussing some ideas for optimizing your financial position, Percival began with obvious enthusiasm. There are sophisticated trust structures that could provide tax advantages while ensuring professional oversight of asset management. And Mother, I've been researching cultural foundations and private museum models that might allow you to maintain control of the collection while receiving substantial tax benefits for public access programs, Ophelia added. You've been researching my financial options without consulting me first? We wanted to present you with comprehensive alternatives so you could make informed decisions, Percival explained. Mother, wealth of this magnitude requires strategic planning that considers multiple generations of family interests. Multiple generations? Are you planning my estate distribution while I'm still alive? Mother, that's not what we meant, Ophelia said quickly, though her expression suggested that generational planning had indeed been part of their discussions. We're simply trying to help you understand options that might not have occurred to you. I felt increasingly uncomfortable with my children's assumption that my inheritance required their guidance and oversight, especially since they'd been at Ravens Hollow for less than 48 hours and were already treating the estate as a family business venture. Percival, Ophelia, I appreciate your concern about proper management, but I'm perfectly capable of making decisions about my own property and assets. But Mother, Percival persisted, you don't have experience managing wealth at this level. The complexity of international holdings, cultural artifacts, staff management, legal compliance, these are areas where professional guidance could prevent costly mistakes. And Mother, Ophelia added, we're family. We want to help you enjoy your inheritance while ensuring that everything is properly structured for the future. I looked at my children, recognizing that their offers of assistance came from genuine care mixed with obvious self-interest in maintaining involvement with assets they'd never expected their family to possess. Children, I need you to understand something important. Your father specifically instructed me to handle this inheritance independently, without family pressure or input about how I should live or what decisions I should make. But Mother, surely Dad couldn't have anticipated the complexity of what he was leaving you to manage alone, Percival argued. Some parents discovered that their children's love was unconditional. Other parents discovered that extraordinary wealth revealed their children's tendency to confuse concern for their mother's welfare with concern for preserving their own access to inherited assets. I was beginning to understand which category described my family dynamics. And I was beginning to appreciate why Bart had been so insistent about keeping his treasure secret until after his death. The breaking point came during breakfast 3 days later, when I discovered Percival on the phone with what appeared to be a legal firm discussing trust optimization strategies for inherited cultural assets. He was speaking quietly in the morning room, apparently assuming I wouldn't overhear his conversation about ensuring proper fiduciary oversight for family wealth management. "Percival, who exactly are you consulting about my estate?" My son looked startled, clearly not having expected to be caught discussing my financial affairs with outside parties. "Mother, I was simply gathering information about best practices for managing collections of this type. There are specialized firms that handle private museums and cultural trusts. You were gathering information about managing my inheritance without consulting me first?" "Mother, I was trying to be helpful. Assets of this magnitude require professional oversight that goes beyond what you might be comfortable handling independently." I felt furious at the assumption that I was incapable of managing my own affairs, and even more furious at Percival's apparent belief that he had the right to research management options for property that belonged entirely to me. "Percival, my property and my financial decisions are not appropriate subjects for your independent research and consultation." "But Mother, we're family. We want to ensure that you're protected from potential mistakes or exploitation by people who might take advantage of your inexperience with wealth management." That afternoon, I found Ophelia in the treasure vault, taking photographs of individual artifacts, apparently documenting the collection for purposes she hadn't discussed with me. "Ophelia, what are you doing?" "Mother, I'm creating a visual inventory of the most significant pieces for insurance and appraisal purposes. With a collection this valuable, you need comprehensive documentation for security and estate planning." "Did I ask you to create an inventory?" "Mother, you mentioned that Dad had documented everything, but I thought additional contemporary assessment might be useful for understanding current market values. I realized that both of my children had begun acting as if they were joint heirs to the estate rather than visitors to property that belonged exclusively to me. They were making decisions, conducting research, and implementing plans without consulting me, apparently assuming that family relationships gave them authority to involve themselves in my financial affairs. "Ophelia, the collection has been professionally appraised multiple times, and all documentation is current and comprehensive. I don't need you to create additional inventories." "But Mother, surely having family involvement in understanding and preserving these assets is beneficial for everyone involved." That evening, I called Mr. Thornfield to discuss the developing situation with my children's behavior. "Mr. Thornfield, my children seem to believe they have some kind of stake in my inheritance decisions, despite the fact that your documentation clearly establishes my sole ownership of all assets." "Mrs. Blackwood, this is precisely the scenario your husband anticipated and the reason he was so specific about maintaining your independent authority over the estate. What would you recommend for handling family pressure about asset management?" "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband left very clear instructions for this situation. If family members began treating your inheritance as a shared resource requiring their input, he wanted you to implement what he called protective disclosure." "A protective disclosure?" "Your husband prepared documentation that would make clear to family members that their future relationship with you and any potential inheritance depends entirely on their respect for your independence and decision-making authority." Mr. Thornfield arranged to deliver additional legal documents that Bart had prepared specifically for managing family dynamics around the inheritance. The papers made clear that any attempt to influence my decisions about the estate, pressure me toward specific financial choices, or treat my property as family assets would result in complete exclusion from any future inheritance considerations. Armed with this legal framework, I requested a family meeting the next morning to address what I described as important clarifications about inheritance and family relationships. "Percival, Ophelia, I need you to understand something crucial about the legal and financial structure of my inheritance." I handed them each a copy of the documents Mr. Thornfield had prepared. "These papers make clear that my inheritance is held in an irrevocable trust that gives me sole authority over all decisions regarding the castle, the treasure collection, and any related assets. The trust also specifies that any attempts by family members to influence my choices or treat these assets as shared resources will result in their complete exclusion from future inheritance considerations." I watched my children read the documents with growing alarm as they realized that their attempts to involve themselves in estate management might have jeopardized their own future financial interests. "Mother, we weren't trying to pressure you," Percival said carefully. "We were simply offering assistance with complex financial management." "Percival, you were consulting with legal firms about trust optimization for my assets without my permission. That constitutes attempted interference with my financial independence. And Ophelia," I continued, "you were documenting my treasure collection for purposes you hadn't discussed with me, apparently treating the artifacts as family property requiring your inventory and assessment." "Mother, we were trying to be helpful," Ophelia protested. "We want you to have the best possible advice and support for managing inheritance of this magnitude. What you were doing was treating me like an incompetent elderly woman who needed family oversight for making major decisions. Your father anticipated this behavior and prepared legal protections to ensure my independence." I stood up, feeling more authoritative and confident than I had in years of family interactions. "Children, I want you to return to your homes and consider whether you're interested in having a relationship with me that respects my autonomy, or whether you're more interested in maintaining access to wealth you didn't know existed until this week." "Mother, you're overreacting," Percival said. "We love you and want to help you. If you love me, you'll respect my ability to make my own decisions about my own property without your guidance, research, or management suggestions." "And if we can't accept those boundaries," Ophelia asked quietly, "then you'll discover that your father was right to worry about how knowledge of this inheritance might change our family relationships. Some mothers learned that their children's love was strong enough to survive the discovery of unexpected wealth. Other mothers learned that extraordinary inheritance revealed the difference between children who loved them and children who loved their money. I was about to discover which category described my own family dynamics, and I was beginning to understand that becoming a queen sometimes required making decisions that prioritized dignity over family harmony. 6 months after that confrontational family meeting, I was sitting in the castle's tower room that had become my private writing sanctuary, watching the Highland sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, while I reflected on the extraordinary transformation my life had undergone since discovering Bart's greatest secret. My children had returned to America immediately after our difficult conversation, and our relationship had undergone a fundamental restructuring that proved Bart's concerns about family dynamics had been remarkably prescient. Both Percival and Ophelia had spent weeks attempting to repair our relationship through phone calls that inevitably circled back to discussions of proper estate management and their desire to help with the challenges of maintaining Ravenshollow. "Mother, we've been thinking about your situation," Percival had said during one particularly frustrating call, "and we realize that maintaining a Scottish castle alone must be incredibly lonely and overwhelming." "Percival, I'm not alone. I have Henderson and the entire household staff, plus I've developed friendships with several neighbors and local historians who appreciate the castle's cultural significance. But Mother, those are employee relationships and casual social connections. We're your family. Don't you want us to be involved in this important phase of your life? I want you to be involved in my life as my children who love me, not as consultants who want to manage my assets." The distinction had proved difficult for them to accept. Their calls became less frequent when they realized I wasn't going to invite them to serve as advisors for the estate, and their communication shifted to perfunctory check-ins rather than genuine conversations about my experiences as mistress of Ravenshollow. Ophelia's approach had been more subtle but equally persistent. "Mother, I've been researching cultural foundations, and I think there are opportunities for you to have significant social impact through strategic charitable initiatives based at the castle." "Ophelia, I'm already supporting several local historical preservation projects and have established relationships with museums interested in rotating access to parts of the collection." "But Mother, you could be doing so much more. With proper planning and professional assistance, Ravenshollow could become a major cultural institution that brings international attention to Scottish heritage. And who exactly would provide this professional assistance? Well, I have connections in the museum world through my design work, and Percival has experience with non-profit financial management. I'd eventually stop taking their calls when it became clear that they couldn't separate their roles as my children from their desire to involve themselves in managing my inheritance. The irony was that living at Ravens Hollow had become more fulfilling than I'd ever imagined possible. Far from being isolated or overwhelmed, I discovered that being mistress of a castle suited my temperament and interests perfectly. I spent my mornings working